Hey y'all, I'm Emily, an almost lifelong quilter with a lot of stories to tell. I have loved quilts and talking about them for as long as I can remember, and I'm here to celebrate the tradition of quilting with you. From family heirlooms to thrift store finds, every quilt holds a piece of history and a little piece of a quilter's heart. Join me every other week to get back to your quilting roots. We'll celebrate quilts and the real people who made them, learn a little bit about the history of quilting, and have lots of fun exploring ways to reclaim tradition in a modern world. I'm so glad you're joining me this week here at Patchwork Revival.
Hello. Welcome to the Patchwork Revival podcast. This is episode 2, where today we will be discussing a historical quilt design rather than a specific quilter. So I want to deliver a little disclaimer. This podcast episode focuses on a historical aspect of quilting. I am a lifelong learner. I explore quilt history for the fun of it. I cannot and I do not presume to discuss or understand every nuance behind a complex history of quilting in America. Now, references for how I formed my ideas will be included in the show notes, and I'll also include links to books that I use and that I think fellow amateur quilt historians might enjoy. So now that this disclaimer has been delivered, enjoy the episode. Thanks for checking out the Patchwork Revival podcast. As a small way to say thank you, I am offering a discount in my pattern shop especially for you. Head over to the link in the show notes to find my shop and enter code REVIVAL for 15% off your purchase. You'll also find a link to Fat Quarter Shop, my go-to online fabric and notions retailer. By using this link, a portion of any purchase you make will help support the making of future episodes. Thanks for supporting the Patchwork Revival podcast. Now, I love traditional quilt design, and it is always surprising to me how much traditional design motifs pop up in contemporary quilt pattern designs and seemingly go under-recognized or underappreciated. So my hope is that this episode will spark your interest in learning about traditional quilt designs, that it will give you confidence to do your own research or engage in meaningful conversations, or maybe even inspire a design or two. So I'm very attached to this particular design, Prairie Queen. Let's dive in. This is a traditionally pieced 9-patch design. So the term 9-patch is actually a pretty generic term that describes a block consisting of a 3x3 grid or 9 total patchwork units. Now, each particular unit may be pieced, but if it's in a 3x3 grid, it is referred to generically as a 9-patch. So let's describe the block. Each corner of the block is a half square triangle that rotates inwards so that the colored portion of the half square triangle is rotated to the middle of the block, and the central block is solid. If you know what a shoe fly block is, it's quite similar to that. Now, each of the units between the half square triangles are actually 4-patch units that are rotated in a very specific direction. If you want a really quick look, you can just check out the quilt in the cover art of the podcast, because that is actually my interpretation of a Prairie Queen quilt block. Now, if you have Barbara Brackman's Encyclopedia of Pieced Quilt Patterns, you'll find it in the 3rd edition on page 190. She classifies the Prairie Queen block as an equal 9-patch and then has it subcategorized as like shoe fly, which basically means that there's a half square triangle or some variation of a half square triangle at each corner of the block. If you don't have this book and you're interested in traditional quilt block design or identification, I highly recommend investing in this book. It's like one of the most fun textbook-esque things that you'll own. So I'll include a link to the book in the show notes in case you're interested. Now, Barbara Brackman's encyclopedia references Ruth E. Finley as her source of information regarding Prairie Queen. So I actually have Finley's book, Old Patchwork Quilts and the Women Who Made Them. It's from the 1920s. And she has an illustrated version of a Prairie Queen block and then describes it as a, quote, simple but widely used 9-patch that every person interested in quilts should know. Challenge accepted, Ruth. So this particular design was first documented as Prairie Queen and has been known since the 1800s. I can feel confident giving this date because at one point a pattern of this block design was published in Hearth and Home under the name True Blue. Hearth and Home was a periodical that was circulated from December of 1868 to December of 1875. So there are a few other publications under this name, even a modern day magazine that's just totally unrelated. But the original Hearth and Home of the 1800s was dedicated to miscellaneous topics that were helpful to agricultural families, basically prairie folk. So things like home decor, quilt patterns, some serial literary works, commodities pricing, etc. And as another fun fact, so for the first year, the editor of the publication was actually Harriet Beecher Stowe alongside a man named Donald Miller. But this is surprisingly unavailable. I haven't been able to find actual scanned copies of Hearth and Home. I've heard that if you're really lucky at an antique store or thrift mall, you can find one, but I've never found one. So if you know of any online source for these, shoot me an email at emily@dreamlandquilting.com because I would love to get my hands on that. So back to Prairie Queen. In Barbara Brackman's Encyclopedia of Pieced Quilt Patterns, she references the design as both True Blue and Prairie Queen. It's actually not uncommon for these designs to be published multiple times in periodicals under fresh or fancy names in hopes of attracting readers, purchasers, and just some popularity to try to get people interested in the magazine. The block itself is relatively simple to piece, and it comes together quite quickly. When the blocks are placed directly next to one another, they form this really neat puzzle-like design over an entire quilt top. I'll include a mock-up of this setting in the show notes so that you can see what all of the blocks directly adjacent to one another looks like. It's pretty neat. But I first learned about the Prairie Queen block in the late 1990s when I had graduated from practicing my patchwork on small projects and decided that I was ready to make my first full-sized quilt. So my grandmother, Mama, chose the pattern for me from a book or a magazine that she owned. I have actually tried so hard to find this book. I was hoping it would be in her sewing room books that I now have, but I have not been able to find it. Actually, today would have been my mama's 100th birthday, and it is no coincidence that I'm releasing this episode today. So if you would like to learn more about my mama, Coralie, and how she contributed to my love of quilting, go check out episode 1 because we talk all about what an amazing woman she was in that episode. So the quilt design itself from this pattern was of Prairie Queen blocks that finished at 8 inches and then were separated with sashing strips and set with cornerstones. So I pieced my blocks over, it took me years. I don't even know how long. But my mama and my aunt helped me finish them up and then set them all together in the sashing strips and cornerstones and then add borders. And I actually remember an entire border that I had sewn on with my mama's machine that ended up having a complete rat's nest on the underside of the seam because I hadn't wound or threaded the bobbin correctly. And so my loving aunt spent so much time seam ripping that out for me. The kicker is that the sashing and the borders were of this sort of yarn-dyed, like homespun woven. And so my aunt sat and painstakingly picked all of those stitches and knots out of a woven fabric. If you work at all with wovens, you'll understand how awful this was. So Aunt Susan, if you are listening to this, I love you and I am so grateful for your patience. Now, once we were finished and the borders were successfully stitched on, my mama kept the quilt top and then waited for her monthly rotation at the church ladies quilting group to have it hand quilted on their frame. I had been quilting with her there before, but I did not get to help quilt my quilt because I was not there. We lived in a different town than my mama. But the way they quilted it was to stitch in the ditch. Now, we're in Texas, and down here, stitching in the ditch basically means coming in 1/4 of an inch from each side of every pieced seam and then basically doing an echoed outline on each side of every single seam in the patchwork. I've learned since, in other regions or in other terminology, stitching in the ditch means stitching actually in the seam. But what I learned it to mean was what my mama and her friends did, which was basically echoing each seam line with quilting. So my mama chose to back it with this plain bleached muslin. I love it because it really shows off all of the detail of that quilting. I look all over this quilt sometimes because there were so many different hands that quilted it. And if you really look at all the stitches, you'll see each little variation of different styles of each woman who quilted it. When it was finished, Mama took it home and she bound it for me. She even rounded the corners, which is such a nice little detail. I included some detailed photos in the show notes of this original Prairie Queen quilt that I made because it is a total treasure to me. It feels like a piece of my history and I want to share that with you. And it's really amazing to see all of this quilting and just to know how much work went into this completely handmade quilt. So now I want to discuss how I sort of came back to revisit this design. Like I said, the original Prairie Queen pattern that my mama and I followed was from sometime in the 90s. And it was written at that time such that the half square triangles were pieced one at a time using actual triangular pieces. So there were so many bias edges to deal with. And the funny thing too is that I remember when I first was introduced to the concept of making multiple half square triangles at a time, I was like shocked that you would have to piece these triangles and then trim them to size. Like, what? Because I basically just zipped these babies through a machine, pressed them open, and meaning open triangles. So I was taught to press to the dark side or whichever one worked. And to this day, I press my seams to the side. But I never realized that some people trimmed half square triangles. Now that's like a normal thing, but it's just funny how times are different. Times are a-changin'. The funny thing is that those little 4-patch units were also pieced of little individual pieces. They were not strip pieced. So I got a lot of practicing piecing, and I think this is probably where I developed my love of nested seams, because you better believe that my mama taught me how to press these blocks so that all my seams nested and things lined up. But basically what happened is my mama cut everything for me according to the pattern and then showed me how to piece each individual unit and then construct them into the entire block. She probably showed me or sent me with a diagram at some point, but I don't really remember referencing it or anything like that. It was a very traditional learning experience of, hey, look at this design. I'm going to show you how it comes together. Now just go have fun and make it. Which was perfect for a beginner, especially a kid, I think. And honestly, it's my favorite kind of quilt pattern to follow because it just becomes this kind of intrinsic knowledge where you can just really freely, quickly construct the blocks. It's almost like cooking where you just know your ingredients and you just whip up something really good. I really wish I could find this pattern. I don't know if it was from a magazine or a book, but I have searched and searched and I can't find it anywhere. So as the years went on and I used my quilt, there were some areas of wear and tear that I've started noticing, which isn't a bad thing. And honestly, it's just part of a quilt's life cycle, if you ask me. But this was a bed-sized quilt. I used it on my full-sized bed through college and beyond. But it just got to the point that I didn't want to keep using it daily so that I could preserve its structural integrity. I also got married. We moved to a king-sized bed. I couldn't really use it there. And then having a full-sized bed quilt is just kind of too big to use as a throw when you're lounging around on the couch. So basically that's what made me decide to revisit the pattern and go from there. So this was in about March of 2021, 3 years ago, almost exactly. I was at that time just newly out of the fog of having my first baby. He was over a year old at that time, and I had really started getting back into quilting on a regular basis. I had always been quilting, but I would definitely say it was more sporadic and casual because I was so busy in residency training. So I look back and realize that in a 3-year span from 2018 to 2021, I got married. I finished residency training, which was a culmination of 8 years of post-grad school and training. We bought our first house. We moved across several states from Kentucky back to Texas. I started my first real job where I was under immense pressure to not screw anything up because that's what doctors feel like. Oh my gosh, I just can't mess anything up. I passed boards, which for my specialty is a 2-ish year process. And then I had a baby. It was so wild. And it was a lot to cram into a relatively short period of time. So throughout that, I always had a project going. But once I got pregnant, sewing was so hard for me. I was giving so much at work, trying to be at peak performance because I was one of 3 women in a very, very male-dominated environment. And I would come home just completely smoked from work. And so I was so tired. I just felt like I could not even sit at my machine, much less make something. So then I actually had my baby. My entire world shifted. He was all I wanted to do all the time, especially once I was back at work, because I went back at 12 weeks postpartum. And every day I just couldn't wait to come home and hold him, hang out with him and my husband. But anyway, I started re-equilibrating a bit, as we do, and I realized how much balance quilting had offered me. I work in a really high-stress job. I'm pretty introverted, and so the end of the day can be a time where I feel pretty drained. I was just running myself ragged by devoting every last drop of myself entirely to my work and my family. So even though it was for a good cause, it was just not sustainable. But the real impetus came in December of 2020 when my mama passed away. Now, she was 96. I think she had some kind of cancer. We don't really know, but I just kind of feel in my gut and just from my background kind of knowledge, I just kind of feel like that's what it was. But she had a pretty rapid decline that was kind of sudden. In some ways, that was a mercy, but it was just kind of shocking. I did get to introduce her to my son before she really deteriorated, and that was the most bittersweet day because she was so overjoyed to know him. I've talked before about what joy she took in her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren, so it was so special for me to get to bring him to meet her. But it was very bittersweet because I knew and she knew that that day was going to be the last time that we saw each other. And that was really hard. But I think that her passing was when I really recognized that I needed to take some time to reacquaint myself with me. And quilting was how I did that. Because I figured out that eventually my baby would sleep a little bit so I could put him to bed and then take an hour or two to just be in my sewing space, let go of the day or week or month or whatever, and just recharge. And throughout all of that, I grieved her, I remembered her, and I started to find my quilting self, knowing that it was just me now. I'm the only granddaughter who she passed on her love of quilting to. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I have to keep carrying this torch. And it just felt like a sort of new calling to me. And I kind of leaned into it and just felt so fulfilled by that. So I got back into consistently quilting, first by completing a quilt using a pattern and a kit that I had found on Instagram. This was when I first started looking on Instagram, was around December of 2020. And I just realized like, wow, there's like a whole quilting community and I want to follow that. And I would share some stuff here and there, but it was kind of a way, I realized that was how I was like shopping for ideas and fabrics and patterns. So I sort of started recognizing after I finished that pattern that I really wanted a throw size quilt, and I didn't have a pattern for this Prairie Queen block. And that's what I really wanted to do, was make a Prairie Queen block in a throw sized quilt. And then, like I said, I looked and looked and looked through my sewing magazines and books that I had from Mama. Well, I couldn't find that pattern anywhere. So this was when I decided to revisit the Prairie Queen design and just revamp it for myself. And to me, it was this kind of special way to just reconnect to my roots, kind of my origin story. And, I had kind of realized I hadn't exactly found my own quilting style. It was in me, and I had started recognizing the things I liked, sort of feeling this pull towards certain modern elements like texture, woven fabrics, using more negative space. But I really deeply, deeply love classic blocks and block-based repeats. So what I ended up deciding to do was to scale up the subunits of a Prairie Queen block so that the finished block would end up finishing at 15 inches. And I made some pretty wide sashing strips to set the blocks in such a way that each one just really had its own kind of space to breathe. And then I also used a different fabric for the center unit in my reimagined version, rather than the same exact fabric as the half square triangles. And I used a plain, like unpieced square as my cornerstones instead of the pieced 4-patch cornerstones from my original quilt. Now, when I finished, I quilted it on my domestic machine. I chose organic wavy lines using my walking foot. And then the backing that I chose was this white on white print that I had in my stash and was actually from my mama. So this quilt does have so much connection to her, and it represents our bond through our love of quilting, and I absolutely love it. Quilting can be a very healing process, and that project was the perfect project at just the right time. So the thing about this quilt is that it finished pretty large. It ended up being 61 by 80 inches. So it's not quite twin sized, but it's a generous sized throw. And I really love using it. I still use it to this day, especially when I'm on call. It's one of 2 quilts that I prefer to sleep under when I'm on call. I guess because it brings me an extra layer of comfort. It's the perfect size for the sleeper sofa bed that I use when I'm on call. I just love it. The other thing about it is that this was the first time that I had sat down and done the math for my own original thought and cut everything, had it ready to go, and it worked out. So I had basically done the legwork of writing this as a pattern for myself. Now, obviously, at that time, I didn't have diagrams or instructions because all of that was just up in my head, but I did use updated techniques compared to the original pattern. So I had Googled HST charts, made them multiples at a time. I calculated strip set yardage requirements and used those, and it all worked out, and I felt so happy because it was like I had unlocked this whole new level of quilting and I actually did okay. And I really enjoyed it. So I kind of started realizing maybe I had begun traveling down my path. I'd started to find my way into quilting in a way where I had a different voice that felt unique, a little bit different. It was really fulfilling because it felt like originality, but it was something that I just sort of began to recognize, and I didn't really do anything with it. But as I became more involved in community with other quilters, at that time it was mostly online and through social media, I started seeing so many different kinds of quilts and people from so many different backgrounds. I started seeing people with lots less experience than I had, like making, selling quilt patterns, being successful. And it just gave me some confidence to start using my voice a little bit. And I just kind of quietly took a pattern writing course. I made some friends through that are just like, friends doesn't even cover it. They're my people. I started doing some pattern testing, and it felt for me really good to use my skills for something beyond my own sewing. Now, sewing for myself and making quilts for myself is just my first love, and it's why I have my head on straight most days. But I definitely started branching out, got a little bit out of my comfort zone, and was enjoying it. So like I said, I got involved through one of my pattern writing courses with some super, super special friends. And we launched the Sweater Weather Sampler in 2023. And wow, it was incredible. It was the first time I released an original design out into the world. And it was just such a joy to see people making something that I had dreamed up and liking making it. I had always been just a little insecure about my style because it's really not modern. I would say it's like contemporary interpretation of deeply traditional design, but I was just never really sure how it would be received to share traditional designs in a fresh way, but I dove in and I went for it, and people enjoyed my first design, and it's one of my favorites ever. So once I figured out that I could write a quilt pattern and that I kind of liked writing quilt patterns, I decided that I really wanted to publish this Prairie Queen as a pattern. Old patterns are pretty different from patterns of today. Like, I feel like what we're used to buying and seeing as quilt patterns are basically ebooks or like instruction manuals, whereas the patterns from the century are just like little templates printed in a newspaper column, like one single newspaper column that you cut fabric out of and put together. So they're very different, and I felt like I really could stand on the originality of my construction techniques, why I chose them, and then there's this idea behind my why of revisiting the pattern in the first place. So I wanted to really honor this block design that has been around for over a century. I did a lot of research, did a lot of Googling, did some soul searching, and then I just now have officially written a pattern for Prairie Queen that I am calling the Prairie Queen Remix. In the pattern, I included history of the block. It contains links to references, links to materials that I really enjoyed using, and I'm really proud of it. I actually shared it with some of my quilting friends, and they really enjoyed making a block or two and shared with me how it brought up thoughts of their moms or grandmas or their own personal quilting journeys. And it's just really special to connect to quilting tradition by doing what we really love the most, and that is quilting. So I wrote the pattern to be a 3-color quilt. You can make it using yardage. You can make a scrappy design using a fat quarter bundle. I always buy fat quarter bundles and I love them, and then I don't ever use them because I just don't know how. But this is a good way to practice mixing and matching and making scrappy stuff work together. I made sure to write the pattern in 3 sizes. I think it would be such a sweet little baby quilt, but I also love a gigantic throw size quilt, as you've learned, but there's a more restrained, smaller throw size included. I really wanted it to have a little something for everyone. I wanted to make this approachable to everyone because, as you might have noticed, I'm on a mission to revive and reinvigorate classic patchwork. And I want everyone to know that there is something in it for them. So if you've never even made a quilt, you could make this quilt. It's patchwork. And that means that each unit you make is building your skill. And so it never has to be perfect. It just has to be fun. So as we come to a close, let's just recap. In this episode, we started out by discussing the history of the Prairie Queen block design. Honestly, there's just no one person we can reasonably attribute it to, but we do know that it has been around for over a century. Secondly, I incorporated the story of how my own quilting history is deeply connected to this design and to making a Prairie Queen quilt, or 2 or 3 or 4 in my time. And finally, I'll also mention that my dive into the history of the design and remembering my own history is what really, really inspired me to jump into making this podcast, which I have had so much fun doing. If you want to make a Prairie Queen quilt, you'll find a link to the Prairie Queen remix pattern in the show notes. Don't forget to use code REVIVAL, REVIVAL, at checkout for a special discount that is exclusive to you as a podcast listener. And here's your reminder to check out the podcast on Instagram at Patchwork Revival Podcast. Now, make sure you're following the show so that you'll be notified when the next episode airs. The next episode is when I'm going to be chatting with my first guest, and I am so excited to share her story with you. To cap off the episode, I am going to read an excerpt from my latest favorite book, The Romance of the Patchwork Quilt in America. It was written in 1935 by Carrie Hall and Rose Kretzinger. It is such a good book. It is so rich and full of knowledge and sort of cultural context of the time and what quilting looked at back in the 1930s and before. I love it so much. I've referenced it so far in every single episode that I've done, and I think I'm going to continue that. So I think the end of every episode, I'm going to have a little wrap up reading from this book. Here is this week's reading from The Romance of the Patchwork Quilt in America by Carrie Hall and Rose Kretzinger. Every ambitious quilter with originality and artistic instincts delights in changing and improving designs. So these young pioneers, using the old patterns as a foundation, worked out new designs and christened them to suit their new environment. I love that. We can still relate to quilters from the 1930s and the 1920s just from doing what we love to do, and that's quilting. Quilting is connection, quilting is community, and quilting is fun. Thank you for being here and hanging out with me on this week's episode. I'll see you next time.
Well, that's it for this episode of Patchwork Revival. I loved having you here with me talking all things quilty. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a rave review. Also, be sure to jump down to the show notes to find links for this episode, as well as the link to my shop where you can enjoy 15% off as a podcast listener with code REVIVAL. Remember that the Patchwork Revival podcast is here to celebrate the connection made in the quilts we love. I'll see you next time.